Welcome to this Architecture Today webinar with Schueco, Making Challenging Sites Work. We have 3 excellent presentations for you and plenty of opportunity for Q&A along the way. So let's get started with Schueco UK's Commercial Director, Sean Butler.
Welcome to the latest in our series of 80 Schueco webinars. In today's webinar, we will consider how design and innovation can create healthy and sustainable living and working environments on difficult and challenging sites. We've got 3 experts who will take us through a range of recent projects they've been involved in, where they've each had to overcome many challenges to create places fit for people to live and communities to flourish. We will also consider architects, planners and developers have collaborated to create attractive new destinations, despite the many constraints imposed on them at sites that once may have been thought unviable. It's a challenge that we fully appreciate at Schueco. As one of the technological leaders for the entire building envelope, we put sustainability and innovation at the forefront of every activity we engage in. For instance, we have a comprehensive range of third-party tested systems offering acoustic ventilation and site access solutions. Let me give you a few examples. Triple glazing as standard with excellent acoustic performance. Active and passive ventilation systems without compromising security, humidity levels, heating, energy losses and noise. Also, we have off-site constructed systems that will deal with and help with site access issues. Thanks once again for joining us. I'll now pass you to Chris, who's chairing this event.
Many thanks, Sean. Hello, I'm Chris Folgers, editor of Architecture Today magazine. Welcome again to this discussion on unlocking challenging sites, which AT is hosting in partnership with Schueco. We've drawn the definition of challenging sites quite loosely. Obviously, some of them are those where the ability to develop them satisfactorily is constrained by environmental factors, noise from nearby infrastructure or pollution. In other cases, it's awkward shapes and sizes or lack of access. And then there are others where the presence of existing communities might create opposition or another kind of a hurdle to overcome for development, or where planning guidance developed for the best of reasons with a view to developing certain kinds of places and communities doesn't seem to allow the kind of development that an architect might think appropriate on a particular site. And so it's a question of working through that to find a way of achieving something that works for everybody. Because of course what we talk about in terms of unlocking challenging sites here isn't about finding ways of developing at any cost or just simply a tick box exercise in order to find ways of exploiting a site. It's about how those kind of sites can be turned into things that will work for future residents, where they have places to live that can be enjoyed without compromise, and where neighbours and local communities can see the positive benefits arriving from development that might initially have raised alarm. And so to discuss all of this, we are very pleased to have an expert panel who have, as it were, come at this problem from all of those different angles that I've just talked about. We have Luke Tozer, Director of Pittman Tozer Architects, Chloe Phelps, who's Head of Design at Croydon Council's development company Brick by Brick and its design studio Common Ground Architecture, and Frederick Paulus Okufo, who is Managing Director of Autor Architecture. And each is going to talk about a few projects in which they've recently been involved. And there'll be an opportunity to ask questions of each after they've spoken. So as we go, please do post your questions into the box which appears below your video player. But now, without any further ado, and to get us started, I will turn to Luke Tozer. So Luke, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. So I'm going to talk through our recently completed projects down in Plumstead for Peabody, called the Reach, which fulfills the tricky sites brief and builds upon previous work that we've done for Peabody at Bethnal Green, which you can see here was immediately adjacent to the railway, which was again a very constrained site. And it's in some ways these constrained sites and unlocking them is where we feel that design adds most value, and where good design really is the thing that can unlock the site. So the Reach is part of Peabody's wider land ownership down in Thamesmead, and is close to Plumstead. You can see here outlined in pink. its location, and it's obviously to the east and south of the Thames and to the east and south of City Airport. At a more local level, its context is defined by Western Way, which is the blue line, the road going to its south and running up from Plumstead Station, which is about a 10 to 15 minute walk away. And quite close to it, on the other side of Western Way, is Belmarsh Prison and the Crown Court, which is its sort of close context on that side, but it sits in a wider context of development that was done in the early 2000s, which is a sort of suburban, out of town in many ways, model of detached houses with car standing in front of them and cul-de-sacs that you can see there. So looking in a bit more detail, the site, our site, is bounded in red, but the blue indicates Peabody's wider land ownership. You can see the sort of fairly flat site with Western Way running to its south, and then to the east are the low-rise detached homes, and then to the north is Charlesmere Gardens, which is this rather unlovely curved terrace of flats with a ground floor of commercial, which we'll come on to. You can see that here, looking from the south, and it was a flat patch of land that was previously allocated for a drive-through McDonald's, and our brief from Peabody was to turn that bit of sort of convenience land into something where a community of homes could exist, and also to try and to give some commercial use on the ground floor. So in terms of the site constraints, it had very little kind of sense of place and felt very out of town, very dominated by the car, with Western Way and with car parking, a sea of car parking you can see there. And it had this kind of inward facing context defined by this existing building, which, whilst architecturally undistinguished, was commercially very successful because it was the only place in the area where you could come to buy your milk or your newspaper, or go to the doctors, or go to place your bets, or get your Domino's pizza. So in terms of the sort of opportunities, the things that we were trying to make out of this context was to try and build upon that emerging neighbourhood centre defined by the Charlesmere Gardens, and to create a sense of place defined by this sort of civic oval to the north, mitigate the noise and to a lesser extent pollution from Western Way, which is a huge road, but rather overscale for the amount of traffic that goes past it. And then to try and enjoy some of the opportunities of the good southern aspect, and whilst the court and Belmarsh Prison are to the south, they're quite a way away and screened by trees, so you actually have quite a long view. So we were asked to sort of look at the redevelopment and what that could be, both in the immediate term in terms of the red line boundary, and then what the opportunity was going beyond it, and the sense of place that we could achieve by creating an improved urban realm immediately adjacent to our site, and then to seed the further development. So we very much see this as phase one of a wider development of the site that builds upon and tries to create a bit of urban context in a suburban place at the moment, and that builds upon some of the sort of town squares, the precedents that you can see on the left there. It also necessitated increase in scale, so you can see this sort of two-storey existing homes to the east, and we came up with this sort of C-shaped kind of mansion block around a courtyard garden, rising from 4 stories on the east to 6 stories on the west. An integral part of that was trying to create a place not just for the local area but for the residents. So that was centred around the heart of the scheme being this south-facing communal garden, which builds upon both Peabody and London's tradition of having garden squares. So we did some analysis of other similar sized garden squares. Got ones that were close to our office, Westbourne Gardens, and then others that had been done previously by Peabody, Adelaide Wharf by Offwood Hall Monaghan Morris, and Peabody Avenue by Haworth Tompkins. And then how the scheme could knit in and build upon this existing place or the existing context to make this new sort of civic sense of and a civic place at the heart of the scheme. So you can see this here in the model. It was 66 homes with a ground floor nursery opening out onto this new neighbourhood centre or neighbourhood area, which would be repaved and planted and could form a flexible space that could be used either as parking during the week or open for neighbourhood events at the weekend. The model here shows the sort of rise in scale of the building and the communal garden. And another important part of it was that this was a 100% affordable scheme, and was part of Peabody's offer to the Greenwich mayoral housing zone. It was the first project completed within, in fact, in any housing zone within London. So this is one of the model made for planning and to demonstrate to locals what we were attempting to do. So you can see here in the ground floor plan, the communal garden at the centre with the flexible space, which is due to be a nursery but could subsequently be subdivided and turned into commercial units if the economics of nurseries didn't work, to the north. And then on the east and western wings are wheelchair dwellings accessed from the street, but leading out through their own private gardens into the communal garden towards the rear. The thing that determined the amount of development on the site wasn't really the scale of the local context, and it sort of sits as its own island, but it was more really the proportion of car parking, because the public accessibility to travel was poor. The most developments in the area had at least one car parking space per dwelling. Here we were able to argue that because of the current land and amount of car parking, we were able to get it down to half. So we've got 33 spaces for 66 dwellings. But had we wanted to build more dwellings, we would have needed more space in order to fit the cars. One of the other critical elements in making the scheme work to provide 100% dual aspect homes and for them to avoid some of the common issues of overheating in well insulated modern housing construction. So to have cross ventilation, natural cross ventilation through dual aspect. And we did that by having the access gallery to the northern side, which then enabled the southern side to enjoy direct views over onto the common garden, and for the balconies and all the amenity spaces to face onto that. You can see here the sort of plan arrangement with 2 cores, which were partly a response to trying to keep the cost of the scheme down because of reduce the number of lifts required, and work with this access gallery arrangement to have all of the dwellings enjoying the views over the common or garden. And that was one of the architectural challenges, really, because in the context of Thamesmead, the access gallery had become a bit of a toxic architectural device, and we were keen to try and reinterpret it and make a civic elevation out of it, rather than it being sort of stuck on element, to integrate it into the language of the architecture. So here you can see the different materials and the different bricks. So we had trying to have a sort of simple, trebiated language with a horizontal emphasis of the lighter coloured brick, and each of the kind of spaces between the windows either being defined by the red brick and a sort of capital of the darker brick, and this spacing being the same, whether it was a window with a vent panel, a window, or the access gallery. Then on the southern side, onto the common garden, having a slightly pared back, simpler language, which was consistent around the three sides facing onto the garden. The southern side of the garden faces onto the Western Way, and in order to mitigate the noise, there's a planted acoustic wall that's built on the southern side, and then there are also trees that will eventually grow up and form a more substantial visual barrier to passing of cars. But also all of the windows facing onto the common garden were or are triple glazed to mitigate the noise. So you can see the sort of passing cars here. Now I'll just take you through some of the construction images. You can see here the cleared site set up, and then this is a sort of time lapse. I'll just rotate through the construction, the concrete frame going up. See it's emerging, brickwork going on, windows in, brickwork being built around them, scaffolding being struck. And then that's how it sits within its sort of wider context and tries to be, I guess, a more European sort of both scale and size of development in terms of an apartment building within a context of many houses, and trying to have something that, given the relative disparate nature of the context, had an architectural language that was confident and sort of sat on its own, but felt as though it was sort of establishing a higher level of quality than the existing buildings that were around it. And part of that was trying to use the brickwork and defining the depth of the openings, the reveals here that you can see, and obviously making the curve of the building out of this series of straight lines of bricks was very important. Trying to enjoy the access gallery being part of the language of the building without it reading as this stuck-on element. And then here is, you can see the sort of kitchen windows that look out across and get good views out across the wider context from the access gallery. The two cores being defined with simple materials, but with each having their own colour, but a similar language of exposed conduits, concrete, metal. Trying really to use the materials to create a building that was, whilst different from its context, still felt like it could have been there before the rest of the context was built. So something that was both visually and physically robust and hopefully timeless. This is a view from the communal garden in the centre. The gardens of the ground floor units opening out onto it. And then the views that you get out onto the communal garden. And Anna, one of the residents who moved in, I guess, just to sort of close on some of the details that are important. Obviously, the balcony is projecting onto the communal garden, enjoy looking onto it, but also the neighbours can meet and chat across it, or they can sit down if they're feeling less sociable, and the sides are screened, whilst the fronts that open onto the garden, where privacy is less of an issue, are more open. And then just the enjoyment of lower sills and details within housing that make all the difference, so that you can sit and take in the common garden and have that relationship with the heart of the scheme. So I'm going to hand over now to Frederick. This is just to close on one of our other schemes that is similarly unlocking a difficult site that is actually full brick by brick in Croydon. Chloe is up to speak as well. And this is our Wandle Road car park scheme, which sits on a site that has lain dormant since the flyover was brought into Croydon, and is now creating 128 homes and some offices and commercial space. And it's currently on site, and you can see how the shape of the building is formed by the shape of the infrastructure. And that's the end of my presentation, but I'm now happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Many thanks, Luke. The practice is obviously making something of a specialism, maybe inadvertent, out of building next to imposing and challenging pieces of infrastructure. The first question that we have is, says, great design, well done. How many person hours taken, and were you under any time pressures as architect?
I'd have to check our records for the number of person hours taken. We do log all of the hours, so it would be a mixture of all the different people. In terms of time pressure, typically these sorts of projects take about 4 years, but inevitably within that 4 years there are periods of frenetic activity and periods of inactivity. So as you'd expect, going in for planning, there's a deadline. Going out to tender, and then working, we were novated to go and work for the contractor. So that comes with its own sort of contractor procurement and construction timetable that we had to work to meet. So looking back on it, I don't recall it, but it all went reasonably smoothly, and that there weren't any I don't think we had any particularly sort of long periods of late nights, and we try and be very disciplined about planning our time. So a specific figure, I'm afraid I don't have to hand.
Yeah, I suppose a related figure and a question that people often ask is, someone says, what was the cost per square metre?
Oh, that's a good question. So our previous one for Peabody was Mint Street, was about 1760 per square metre, but that was completed in 2014. And this is our third project for Peabody. I think this is about £2,560 a square metre. Right.
And a question which I'll just summarise, which is, how did you strike the balance between maximising the development potential of the site and preserving quality, e.g. by only having dual aspect apartments?
We'd looked at, I didn't include them in the presentation, but we looked at lots of different sort of development configurations, and it was trying to find something that balanced making a place, as I hope I described, both for the community and the residents, and making something that stacked up and was viable for Peabody. as I mentioned, we could have actually got more on the site, really. We probably could have added at least a floor onto each and still preserve the daylight sunlight to the neighbouring buildings. But the car parking was the sort of limit, and actually was one of the things that is still an issue in developments that we're working on, where we're trying to avoid undercroft car parking because of the sustainability, the impact of significant amounts of concrete, and the cost of doing so on something that may only be relevant for a few years to come. So it's trying to do something that allows, whilst we've got 50% parking at the moment, which kind of determined the amount that we could get on the site, the hope is that over time that would reduce and that would become more landscaped and less car parking. And
two questions back to back, both asking about planning, whether it was an easy journey through with any hurdles, and whether there were, second question, very similar, whether there were challenges after submission or during the pre-app process.
Pre-app was slow. I think Greenwich were, it's not an uncommon situation at the time, they were very understaffed, and so it was a bit painful in terms of getting feedback. We had a CABE design review, which was good. It was quite robust. They did suggest, actually, one of their suggestions was cutting a public route through the communal garden, because there was a crosswalk, a pedestrian crossing on Western Way to the south, which comes sort of in the middle of the garden. We had to work quite hard to convince them and ourselves and the planners that actually that wasn't a significant route, and that actually it was better to keep the common garden private for residents and for the nursery, so that they got to enjoy that as an asset. And in fact, people moving in had came from other parts of London, Barking, Acton, and actually further afield, someone came from Portsmouth, and one of the reasons they came and wanted to move into the development was because of this communal garden and the sort of sense of community that you can potentially get from it. So you get to meet your neighbours in a space that is yours collectively, and get to enjoy it. So that was a critical part of the scheme.
We have a couple of questions on the subject of engagement. One asking how extensive the process was, or the nature of the process. One about the proposed scaling of the scheme, but then also you mentioned the unpopularity of the deck access type locally because of historic precedents. So was there any kind of particular way of demonstrating that, other than what you described about the material quality of the, making sure the material quality lived up to people's hopes?
Well, interestingly, there wasn't great opposition to it not being a drive-through McDonald's, albeit there is a drive-through McDonald's closer to the train station anyway. So it wasn't that we were not depriving the community of that asset. It was just a blank piece of land surrounded by Charlesmere Gardens and two-storey housing. So individual householders nearby were consulted, and I think there was a recognition that something needed to happen with the land, and that Peabody were keen to try and put shovels in the ground and show that, because they've taken ownership of much wider parts of land of Thamesmead, that they were able to not just talk the talk, but they could build stuff and walk the walk and provide new homes. So actually there was in some ways more consultation done after it was finished, in taking residents from elsewhere within Thamesmead around and to show them what new homes could be like. And actually some of the most positive comments were from that sort of engagement, where existing residents within Thamesmead who had separate kitchen, dining and living rooms were then introduced to the more open plan arrangement of a kitchen, dining, living room with the dual aspect. And whilst they've been very resistant to that before, they came and saw the opportunity of it and saw how nice it could be. And similarly with the deck access, actually, that was, I think deck access it's neither inherently good nor inherently bad. It's the way of accessing your home. It needs to be made such that you have some of the same kind of opportunities and the same levels of privacy that you would have sort of in any other way of accessing your home. So just trying not to make the corridors too long, not too many rooms you're passing, and preferably those not being bedrooms either.
I think we've just got time for one more, which is on whether you've looked to measure embodied carbon in the scheme.
We've yet to do a sort of, there were planning and planning stage carbon assessments that were done, and so there's embodied carbon in the construction, and then we are looking to do some post-occupancy evaluation with Peabody to see the carbon in use, but that's at the early stages at the moment. It wasn't only moved in a few months ago.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're at the end of our allotted question time. There are still questions coming in, so can I ask the audience, please do, as we go through the presentations, get them in early so that we hopefully can get to yours as we go. But now we turn to our second presenter, who is Frederick, who will take it from here. Thank you.
Yeah. So hello, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation. We're quite excited to be part of this talk. And I'll start with introducing ourselves quickly. So we're a specialist residential practice with studios in London and Berlin. We started out just before the 2008 crisis hit, which taught us a lot about the economic viability of projects. We're now known for maximizing local potentials through a dedicated design methodology, which I'll explain a bit more later. And we've recently been recommended by the Housing Design Awards CEO David Blood to Urban Regeneration. So quite happy to be able to talk here. In regards to the small sites discussion or complex sites discussion, we actually happen to specialize in them over the past 12 years, where we have now worked over 20 different boroughs, receiving 20 awards and shortlists for unlocking complex sites. And we have been through our portfolio, analyzing the data, seeing that 38 of our 40 projects so far succeeded with one or more floors above pre-application or planning advice. And that translates into a gross development uplift of about 38 million on a total of 272 million in GDV, an average uplift of about 14%. So for us, a small site is defined by what we have also been quite focused on over the past 12 years to find a design methodology to which we can consistently apply on small sites. And that is to provide a high level of urban design integration, architectural integration, and prepare for cost-effective construction. All of these three key ingredients make a scheme economically viable and then enable more funds for higher quality housing and a higher quality architecture. So this is an overview of some of the projects that we will be speaking about. Our project range is from about 1 to 110 units, plus 4,000 square meters of offices and 150 units in Germany. And on the average size is about 5 to 8 million in construction value. The reason why we show this all in as a as an array of projects is that we would like to focus on challenging sites, and in particular the small sites discussion that is currently discussed by the GLA and its capacity to provide much needed housing for London. And we saw that the inspectorate, or because of the inspectorate, the housing provision was dropped by about 20%, which we think is a mistake, and we would like to show how this could be done if a systematic approach was chosen. In total, what we see as an office happening in London is that space is becoming constrained, and small and challenging sites need to be infilled, but the policy is not applicable as clear-cut as on a wide site, where you can say, this is my amenity, this is my housing, this is my car parking, and so forth. The areas overlap. But we found there is an industry standard model called the pestle analysis model that has 6 layers, and those 6 layers can be applied to 3-dimensional space, as in 6 surfaces of a cube, if you want. So the correlation and the relationship between the layers. And these are the political, economic, social, technical, legal, and environmental. So all our schemes have this underlying organizational grid, which we use to communicate the opportunities and constraints with councils, to make schemes or the scheme discussion more transparent and target-driven. Because what we find is the moment confusion occurs, fear sets in, and it turns on both sides, councils not wanting to sign something off because they are not sure if they can justify something or not being harmful to future residents. So I would like to, in the following, run you through 3 projects very briefly in our 3 sections of urban design integration, architectural integration, and cost-effective construction. The first scheme is one in Ealing. This is a scheme that established a 4-story building in a 2-story residential area, overcoming 26 reasons for refusal. And the GDV uplift in the discussion for the extra floor is about 1.6 million. So the pestle analysis would show here the constraints analysis, turning constraints into opportunity. The urban design grid, merging it into those constraints, is shown here on the left. And on the right, you see how the scheme sits in composition with the protected Class A trees, outlook angles, and so forth. And this arrangement stood at appeal, even giving us a cost award, and then being nominated for Best UK Building in the Building Award, and being highly commended from the urban designers or the urban design officer of Ealing. It also shows that on the area in front of the protected trees or under the protected trees can be used as amenity space, which normally is not, or was back at that time, not allowable for being counted as amenity space. But because of its quality on challenging sites, some common ground and leeway needs to be found with the council, and is possible. The second scheme is one scheme in Walthamstow, where 2 other teams got stuck for 7 years, and this application got approved as submitted without the reduction in units, which was previously requested by the council. We always copied a site image in just to show the site typology. Here, the pestle analysis was mainly focused on understanding the history of the urban grain and how it came into being, resulting in a scheme that absorbed the odd angles of its context by then providing 4 rectangular open courtyards between the new scheme and the existing scheme. In that, literally merging the past development with the future of when it was when the railway development came to Walthamstow. And here it also shows how the story grid results in a sustainable urban design integration, where you have very clear layering on the site from public to semi-public and private. The scheme is moved to the north boundary with no overlooking, so very closed facades to also minimize energy loss, and is open to the south. These are impressionist views of the site, and this is the north boundary design. And this is a scheme at the front, also showing in the houses south-facing roof terraces. The third scheme now is in Harrow. And this scheme was interesting because it changed the draft local area action plan to allow an extra floor for an entire road, which resulted on this scheme in 5 extra units. The analysis here was not focusing, as on the other schemes, on constraints of the site or the history, but on the planning policy and the planning policy intent of the site. So this was the draft area action plan, where it shows 3 to 4 stories along the whole road, and we are now at 6 stories. It shows that this geometric story grid with an internal layout, which is not shown here, would show how this particular area in the town center can be fully maximized in line with the area action plan intention. And that proposal was more efficient or more sustainable than the draft area action plan, and hence we got that extra density on the site. And this scheme, for instance, was very well communicated with the officers who are using it now as an exemplary development in terms of communicating and also enhancing local policy. The next 3 projects are smaller and are 3 unique unit types that we developed, or special unit types that we developed for particular sites, and are more about the internal functionality of the architecture merging with the external space of a small or challenging site. Because we find that the more a site is condensed, the more the inside has to work with the outside. So this is a scheme running past 27 rear gardens and had 21 reasons for refusal, which it overcame. So in here you see a section through the 100 meters of housing where you have a 4.5 meter entrance volume that corresponds with the recessed amenity space in a 5 meter distance to the neighboring boundary. The garden is recessed to reduce the noise impact on the gardens, on the neighboring gardens, but at the same time at the front to take the kitchen out of the view, of the eye level view of passing pedestrians. And there is a view at the bottom of the stair, a glass volume that then can look from the sofa straight up above the door light without overlooking the other neighboring facade or boundary. These are louvers, they're tilted upwards, so they allow light into the windows, but protect views downwards into the neighboring gardens. These are the 100 meters of houses, which wanted to be 2-bedroom houses initially by the council, but we managed to increase the density, or make them 3-bedroom, 6-people houses. The next scheme is a scheme we did at Weston Williamson, or where I worked and then transferred before I set up by myself. But I like showing this scheme because it shows how you can use local heritage to address, or you want to bend or negotiate policy, local planning policy. So here is the Slim Highway site, we're moving up to 4 meters to the boundaries of it. And here you can see opposite the Frank Wheeler houses with these large artist studios on the top floor in these glass volumes. And we were able to offset a double height living room space in architectural correspondence to this heritage, and therefore offsetting the lack of amenity space on that site, and saying that you have a large internal living room volume that actually then becomes your amenity in line with the nearby listed buildings. And that was accepted to pass for planning. So you have a duplex unit on top of a 1-bedroom unit in this case. This view shows large window blades which protect from views and the lights of passing cars. This is just for the facade design. And then thirdly, we have another, we find quite interesting scheme, which is Dudden Hill Lane, the warehouse house, we called it. And this is a typology that applies to many challenging or small sites which are warehouses in London. And the question here was that we didn't use heritage or the constraints of a site, but just a question, how can you live in a warehouse? And this is the typology of such a shell, into which we cut light wells and added green onto the roof, making the roof of the shell almost like a green oasis for the surrounding neighbors, and created 3-bedroom, 6-person units that interlock with each other and actually give you a longer unobstructed private view across your own property than it would be looking 7 meters onto your neighboring garden. And then thirdly, that is preparation for cost-effective construction. So all our schemes are quite sculptural because of the pestle analysis procedure, for them using sites, challenging sites more efficiently, but also more integrative. But still, all construction grids are rectangular in nature and correspond with the floor plans, so that you can also use techniques such as dimension-driven design to optimize an entire scheme holistically in connection with the site. This is Wood Street, which we saw, which was a quite odd-angled scheme, but internally it's not. Station Road was more geometric or more rectangular anyway, with 100% dual aspect units, despite the depth of the building. We then have the Muse, where we reduced the construction cost for the frame by 28%, from a frame cost of 330,000 by using developing a hybrid prefab system where we used CLT for the geometric load-bearing parts and exchanged all non-load-bearing parts by timber cassettes. And that system, or that doing, in connection with the bricks that were attached in 4 different ways to the moving fabric, was shortlisted for the Timber Award and also for the Brick Award. So what we want to say is that we have been searching for the past 12 years for a way to better communicate with councils, and from our history of 2008, make schemes economically viable, but also integrating them truthfully into their context, so they're not crammed, but in dialogue with the context. And that shows the feedback that we get from councils, and just lately have been speaking at Urban Design for London to 23 councils discussing small sites. and actually seeing the gray area that there is, because small sites can't be judged as black and white. There's your garden, there's your parking. Things become very difficult for planners to judge if they're not from the trade, so to speak. So thank you very much.
Many thanks, Frederick, for taking us through those projects, which show that there's certainly a lot of opportunity, even where it looks unpromising, or in fact, sometimes there's a lot of opportunity because it looks unpromising. We'll get straight into the questions. The first one is asking about what level of preliminary engineering advice you typically obtain to help develop schemes for planning, i.e. pre-planning, I suppose, basements, stepping floor plates, existing buildings, flooding. So, you know, they're on, I suppose, typically quite complex situations where that's a different form of viability that might affect whether a scheme goes ahead as intended.
So if I just recap that question, so how much we consider the technical buildability of schemes?
I suppose how much, yes, exactly. You actually work with engineers and so on ahead of planning.
Yeah. So I mean, the part of our analysis, or part of the entire preparation of the schemes is we're quite focused on the technical aspect. So that, I mean, when the buildings are designed, that they're actually buildable later. So that is quite a big part of the consideration of designing our schemes. Would that answer the question?
I think so, yes. And I think we have a question now about the cost, I guess, per square meter for both the Waltham Forest project or the Walthamstow project and the Muse, the related Muse house scheme.
Yeah.
And the second part to that question, which asks, that one seems to have gone to appeal. What proportion of these challenging sites had to be won at appeal rather than a local decision?
There's two questions.
Yeah.
One is the construction cost.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. So the construction cost for the construction cost for the Muse was £180 per square foot, excluding the contractor's profit. So that one was actually went quite well, and we spent quite a lot of time looking at the detailing of those schemes and how to fit them together in the most efficient way. And so for the Walthamstow scheme, I would have to look that up. I don't have that to hand now.
What proportion of the schemes, I guess, that you work on, or certainly that you've shown, were won at appeal rather than at the original local planning decision?
It's, I mean, from our whole portfolio, we have done, I mean, out of these 38 schemes, we had to go to appeal on 4.
Right. So
the 2 presented, and then we had one on a roof, on a mansard roof, and then another one. It's a small infill site. It's a single house actually in Tufnell Park. Those are the only ones we had at appeal.
Okay. And a question here is about the way that you choose to kind of describe your projects generally, which says. Putting a GDP uplift value on each project is unusual for architects. We don't often speak frankly about our role in a commercial system. Why did you decide to do it? Yeah,
that is, I mean, our whole approach and the whole presentation here was that we see certain topics are not spoken about openly. And we see that a lot of these small sites are stuck at present also in London and are not taken forward because of the economic pressure developers have with these sites. They take longer in planning. There are more, your entire input on these schemes is higher. So what we wanted to show is that, just to make clear to developers, which is our main client base, we've only been on one housing framework, and the rest is private developers. And we want to prove or also give them confidence that they can actually build these schemes and take them forward and not shy away from those. Would that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is, I suppose, an unusual thing to kind of put a number on it. That there are other numbers that people put on a typical kind of development project case study, but not often GDV. Someone else asks whether you could explain a bit more what you mean by story grid.
The story. I mean, the story is a part that I haven't mentioned in our presentation. It's more a poetic part. When one looks onto these schemes or our webpage, every scheme is driven by a story that is linked to the locality. So, for instance, Church Road, if the first scheme that was presented, there are three churches in 300-meter distance in one line, linking Uxbridge Road with Crossrail, for instance, in this particular site. And we were able to go up to 4 floors because we linked ourselves in height to the 3 churches, and we have 3 volumes or 3 cubatures of the scheme. And the cladding material, you can also see, is spanning from ridge down to first floor to address the large roofs of the churches. Or the Dutton Hill scheme, where the scheme is developed from the local warehouse shell that was on the site prior. So we always like to develop a poetic element to a scheme's rationale. And because our approach, we like to show the relationships between the different layers of the analysis, which is political, technical, sustainable, and so forth, and expose them. So therefore we call it grid on one side, and we call it story grid because we always have that story element to every scheme. That's also our name. Our company name is called Autor, which is the German word for author. Yeah, to write stories or urban stories.
And another question relates a bit to the second part of what you were talking about there, which is the pestle analysis, which is obviously drawn from, as it were, from outside the normal way of talking about architecture, drawn from another field. And someone says, is it more useful in shaping the project or communicating with local authorities who might have a different mindset or background to designers?
Yeah, you see, our whole approach is, we spend quite a lot of time for one or the other reason, just to look at the English planning system, which is quite different to Germany, where everything is done on master plans. So here you have a huge part, or half of every project is pure negotiation and talking with each other. And we find if people have the same base of knowledge, it's much easier to come to conclusions. So showing a decision matrix, these grids are done from urban design, site functionality, and site constraints, those 3 layers, and show how they interconnect. We find it much more helpful to speak with councils, because you can say, okay, if I follow your wish on this item, I can show you the compromise that we have to do on another one. And so we find that people engage much better on the schemes because they can see really how the architectural maze moves, which always is architecture, to find the best compromise between multiple layers.
And it does. And I think we've got time for one more question, which is a sort of follow-on from that one, which is really someone asking whether you ever look at sites where a certain amount of development is in a sense achievable within constraints, but not compatible with quality. Do you ever recommend developing less than is permitted?
Certainly. We only have one scheme where we had the feeling out of these 38 where we thought maybe that should have been a floor less, I have to admit. But generally speaking, we really find, and this is what I made the statement on the small sites policy, you can really it's the same as if you pack the boot of your car. There's always one way of doing things, and it really fits without a problem. And that's really what we always seek to achieve, that it's a win-win situation rather than a cramping.
Well, thank you very much for that, Frederick. We're now at the end of our question time. Thank you for your presentation, and particularly thank you for beaming in from Croatia, which is where I know you are. So thank you very much for that. And now hand over to Chloe.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi. So been a number of presentations so far, and I guess what I've realised is that there is no such thing as an easy site, particularly in London. And I guess what I'm going to be majoring on is one about kind of the smaller sites programme in Croydon, and particularly around issues around viability and kind of making sure that sites are ultimately deliverable. To give you a bit of background, I head up the design team at Brick by Brick, which is known as Common Ground Architecture. So we are a design team in our own right, and we work with other people. It doesn't necessarily, Brick by Brick isn't our sole client, but we do sit in-house and have been integral to the delivery of the Smaller Sites programme that they've been working on for the last 4 years. We're based in Croydon and born from the local authority, and this is my team at the moment, stood outside the Brick by Brick offices in Croydon that we've designed, so our shop front there in the background. So I guess the sites in Croydon that we've been working on this is kind of gives you a little snapshot of 6 of them, but they're typically not straightforward. Croydon Council itself is not a huge landowner in the way that a lot of the central London authorities are. The sites that it tends to own are quite small and infill plots, either on existing estates, old garages, community centres that have no longer fit for purpose, or that are kind of costing a lot of money to run, that would be re-provided as part of the development. And then old building stock, and this picture here is one of the ones that Luke was working on and is now finished. So, sorry, next slide. So to give you a bit of background in terms of the brick by brick model, so to speak, we've been going for about 4 years and it was set up to kind of accelerate housing delivery in the borough. Previously, the borough had been delivering about 20 new homes a year, and that was largely based around the kind of the viability challenges of bringing forward smaller sites. And it was also, this model is demonstrating the kind of the circular economy, I guess, of our business with the local authority, where we're looking to build homes for sale and for rent for local people, and the profits go back to Croydon Council to reinvest in the borough. And then we started off with a programme 4 years ago of 50 sites. That's now grown to, we've got 80 live projects, and this is a snapshot of 9 of those projects, some of which are complete. There's 3 in this kind of little deck. 2 of them are completed by HTA. One of them is our very own pump house in the middle there, and then there's some CGIs of schemes that we're working on at the moment. So this is Croydon. The little black marks all over it are our development sites. Croydon, if you don't know it, is kind of 6 o'clock on the London. You look at the Greater London area as a kind of a clock. At the very top of the borough it kind of partially sits with Crystal Palace, and very south is kind of rolling Surrey Hills. Common Ground are doing 10 of those sites at the moment, so these pink marks on this map. The first site I'm going to talk about, I've got 3 that I'm going to run through, is Selsdon Court, which is, as you can see, kind of quite a small scheme, 8 affordable homes, and it's just south of Croydon Metropolitan Centre, but kind of in quite a suburban context. So this is our site. It sits behind an existing council-owned block here, and it's got the railway to one side and quite a suburban context. So I've already said that. And this is quite an unusual street form where there's a kind of houses that front onto the main road and then another street that kind of sits behind the main street but doesn't get terminated in any way. This is a photo taken from the top of that street, and as you can see, this is the existing buildings over to the left-hand side, and you can see the garages, 3 garages, and then there's quite a rise up in topography towards the railway at the top where there's quite a few trees. There's obviously very close neighbours to the north of the site that enjoy kind of amenity and outlook we're looking to retain. So I guess this is kind of a study in kind of finessing a project that's sat kind of in a very fragile way, but on the knife edge of viability all the way through. So to start off with, we kind of identified quite a straightforward development plot on the right of the site, which sat kind of at the upper end of this, at the higher point of the site. And I guess this is kind of a slide to show you the different really, really subtle moves that we made. And it's a little bit like Grand Old Duke of York in many ways, but we tried it at the top of the hill, then we tried it at the bottom of the hill, and we tried it halfway up. And none of these were viable and very, very close to being viable. And then we looked at houses, and they were almost very viable, but we needed to get a 6th one in. But as you can see, it's very, very difficult. So we then, where we ended up, and there was probably another 20 or so variations on that, was quite a small footprint. So we kind of reduced down the original aspiration from kind of 12 homes right down to 8. And to kind of pull it away from the boundaries and set it down in its context as much as possible. We've ended up with quite small apartments. They're all 1-bedroom flats, which I guess when we're dealing with a bigger program, we can get the family units on another site. And I think with this instance, this was the only viable way of bringing this project forward. But it meant that we could kind of create a very compact footprint, which meant that we could keep 18 metres away from the existing building. We could minimise our impact on the neighbours to the north. We could make sure that there was a relationship in terms of the street frontage with the residential street to the south. And you can kind of see on this one where we've got the trees that sit adjacent to the railway boundary. And this is just some site sections looking at where we've actually ended up locating the building. We ended up doing, we ended up having to do quite a lot of more cut than we originally anticipated. So I've jumped on already in here, but this just ended up being the most efficient way of getting the building onto the site. So what we have done is to make sure that the daylight and sunlight in this lower level flat gets enough amenity from kind of the cutaway terrace, and then the apartments above it have balconies over the top of that. So this is something quite different scale. This is Bramley Hill, which is an estate-based scheme, and just a little bit further north from Selsdon Court, but to the southwest of the metropolitan centre. That's 58 homes. I'm going to kind of rattle through this. I could probably talk for a good hour on this one alone, but you can see the red is the development site, or development zone that kind of runs through the existing estate. And this is an aerial view looking north over it. There are a number of things to consider. Obviously, we've got an awful lot of existing residents and a really strong community that kind of lives on the site at the moment. There's also fantastic trees around the site. So to the north, you can see this kind of swathe of quite mature trees. There's this amazing oak tree that sits in the middle of the site. And then over here, we've got two grade A trees that kind of sit near to an existing play space. There's a lot of garages on the site, which largely too small for contemporary cars. So they were the kind of the prime opportunities for development. We've also got a conservation area just off to one side, so needed to consider any impact on height. And there's also a rise up in topography from the metropolitan centre to the right-hand side of this image back up to the top. And then there's the play area that I've already talked about on that side. So this is our kind of urban approach to the site, which was putting kind of first and foremost, putting kind of buildings that address the street frontages. So along there's, and then looking at the opportunities on the garage sites. And then in the very center of it was an opportunity to put a new kind of garden, which has got play space and growing beds for existing residents. And the plan with that is to use that as an opportunity through the construction process to put in place some active measures before the scheme is finished. And then this is a real snapshot of how one part of the scheme really evolved through kind of engaging with different people and kind of looking at the viability of the scheme. A few options we looked at, and you'll see the last option is where we are at the moment, and the scheme has gone in for planning. We made a final kind of move with this larger flat block in the centre to kind of move it away from the existing buildings to the south to maximise their views out. And then this is what it looks like. So we're looking to have the flatted development on one side that takes inspiration from the existing existing buildings on the site. And they're suited as a family of buildings with the houses on the site, that they're these twinned mirrored forms. And then finally, and I'm going to whiz through this because I'm conscious of time, is one that we finished as part of the first programme. So this is our site just near Norwood Junction Station, called Pump House on Station Road. It's within a conservation area, and is a site that lay dormant for, well, probably since the 1950s, when a leatherworking hall on the site was demolished. And in that time, a lot of windows and all sorts of services had crept up on adjoining properties, kind of enjoying views over the site, which made it quite complicated. So this was our kind of initial design response to the site. It's the 3-storey context, and so we looked to kind of make as much of the site as we could. So we came up with this interlocking form on the right of that screen, which is 2 forms, allowing us to kind of have a block that wraps the corner at a lower level, connecting it with the existing context, and having another building that pops up out of it, avoiding the need for kind of setback roofs and things like that. And allowed us to look at a 5-storey building in a 3-storey context, inspired by the Odeon building that stood on the site next door, but was also demolished in the 1970s, but real loss. And to flick through kind of our design approach, again, it was very much about a symmetrical approach, referencing the Odeon. So this slide demonstrates how the white building slots into the red brick perimeter, knitting it into the surroundings. And you can see on this model view how much of the gymnastics we needed to do in plan form to the rear of the site to safeguard daylight and sunlight to existing windows. Then moving on to what it looks like today. So the ground floor will have a new library that's being provided by the council. You can see the red brick from this viewpoint really knits in with the existing Victorian high street facades, and then the white building sits proudly in the street scene without being overpowering. And then this is a little close-up of the red brick element of the building, and a little bit of greenery, and that's it. I think we're doing questions now.
Thanks, Chloe, for that insight into just a slice of what's obviously a much larger program, but it gives an indication of both the kind of subtlety and the complexity of that work. We move on with questions, and the first one I'll attempt to paraphrase because it's quite a long one, but it's essentially asking how to whether it's possible for you to clarify slightly the relationship between the council, the development company Brick by Brick, and Common Ground Architecture, which I think the questioner is thinking is as it were your private business, but I think is in fact part of the development company Brick by Brick, and how whether that creates any particular issues for you or specific particular situations that you need to overcome in terms of fair tendering, public procurement, competition law, and those kind of things, which perhaps are different to the way that projects are normally approached.
Okay, I'll try and answer that question. So I guess Brick by Brick is a private development company in its own right. It's wholly owned by the council. So all of the profits go back to the council at the end of the day. But in itself, it's a commercial entity, so it acts quite differently to a local authority kind of in the way it procures projects. So we kind of act like any other developer would do. We have a commercial responsibility back to Croydon Council, and we publish our business plan on an annual basis, and we're kind of open and transparent about that, and that's all on our website. Common Ground Architecture is a trading as company of Brick by Brick, so we are we are part of Brick by Brick. So it's basically our architectural team is kind of branded to a certain extent, and that allows us to also go and trade with other local authorities and developers. In terms of our relationship back to the council, obviously a lot of our projects are in Croydon, and we then obviously need to interface with the planners, building control, and all of those things that everybody else needs to do as well. But we operate very simply, and we go through a pre-app process with the planners, and we use a planning consultant. And so when we get kind of tested in the same way as every other developer does, and in many cases we probably get a slightly tougher ride. But yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. I can go into more detail, but
I suspect it's probably one that you could answer at enormous length. So I think that's a great summary. Someone obviously, Common Ground is not the only architect working with Brick by Brick. There's quite a number, and the next question, in fact, asks, as a director of a small practice, how could we collaborate? Is I suppose by what means do you go out and select people, or find new practices to work with?
We're always looking for new and interesting practices to work with. We do direct appointments, so we don't really have a framework that we commission on a regular basis. So it's really just a matter of get in touch, drop me an email. I'll probably get loads now. We're also so we're always looking for interesting people to join kind of our stable of architects. We obviously do get approached by quite a few people, so we can't work with everybody. But if there's something particularly interesting, be it kind of, you've got a particular interest in zero carbon schemes, we're promoting that a lot at the moment because we've signed up to becoming a One Planet Living leader. So all of our schemes from now on will have a One Planet Living action plan working towards becoming zero carbon. We're also running a competition at the moment, and this is very much like an ideas-based competition, which is looking for up and coming practices with a focus on finding people that perhaps don't necessarily have the back catalogue within their current practice. They might have had that experience in previous practices, and it's very much an ideas competition about kind of ideas for a better world. We're also looking for practices as part of that to have a really, really strong commitment to diversity, either through leadership or within the organisation itself, and taking active measures to really address those issues in the industry at the moment.
Thank you. And our next questioner asks about, it's a questioner actually who works within another local authority, London local authority, is asking what role modular plays in your thinking about housing provision for Croydon?
We're always looking to do more and more modular. We haven't done, so I guess to date, the issues we've got with smaller sites is getting them off the ground in the first place. We did a whole review the first time that the first programme that's just finishing now, of how we could do that in off-site manufacture, and looked an awful lot across whether it's modular or volumetric off-site through to kind of panelised systems, and ended up with those schemes looking at timber panelised construction as being the most appropriate form of development or construction on those sites. The types of sites that we're working on didn't suit the available volumetric modular products that were available at that point because of getting access to the sites. Also, costs is really difficult, and a lot of the schemes are kind of under 20 homes and quite irregular. So it was quite difficult to find a viable modular contractor that we could work with on that. However, we have got more and more larger sites coming forward, and we just continue to work with the industry to kind of find a partnership of contractors to work with. So it's something that I wouldn't say we've cracked, but it's we're constantly talking to people.
Yeah, and that sort of leads into our next question, which is again, you referenced most of these schemes being a kind of viability being a question that attends them throughout until they actually get built almost. What are there some things that might what are the things that most threaten the viability of small sites in Croydon?
Everything in the ground. So the sites that and I think a lot of local authorities have the same issue, and a lot of small sites have the same issue. There's a reason a lot of these sites haven't been developed before. They're quite often the leftover bits of other developments, or they're the old garages, and there's either contamination, utilities, storm drains, you name it, it's in the ground, and that just drives up the cost exponentially before you even started designing anything. So the thing that we're finding is that we have to really, really carefully design what is within our control, which sits on top of all the money in the ground, and be really, really mindful about kind of where we do spend our money. So with the Selsdon scheme is a great example of that, because it looks very, very simple and elegant now that we've finished it, and it looks like a really straightforward solution, but it was a lot of work to get there. We kept the envelope of it quite square and rational, which worked really well with the building in front of it, which was also kind of similar sorts of proportions. But yeah, it's everything in the ground just makes it very, very difficult.
And again, a sort of follow-on question that relates to that. Someone asking about the typical cost per square metre. I imagine it varies from scheme to scheme, but do you have a sort of a territory in which they all sit?
Yeah, they go up, and I mean it's getting increasingly difficult. I think the first sites that we were working on 4 years ago, we were trying to keep costs down at 2,500 a square metre. But that was quite tricky with this proportion and scale of the sites that we're working on. And we're now seeing them kind of creep upwards to nearly 2,800 up to £3,000 a square metre, which sounds really punchy. And I get told constantly, we can do schemes for far less than that. But the reality is that with the increase in fire provision that we're bringing into the buildings, the cost of knowing what is actually in the ground, and these slightly smaller, slightly awkward schemes, they do start to get up to the £3,000 a square metre quite quickly. But we try and target around 2,800.
And last question I think we've got time for is about engagement with residents on existing estates or neighbours, because obviously most of these there are people living very close by. What's your typical approach, and how do you find that they accept the prospect of development? Because in the case of somewhere like Bramley Hill, they are losing at least a little bit of amenity.
Yeah, it's never an easy conversation to have, and obviously we're developing an awful lot of sites in Croydon. Typically on the estate sites, we have 2 to 3 pre-planning engagement sessions at least, where the first one's very much about listening and talking and introducing ourselves and learning more about the existing place, how they use it, what works for them, what doesn't work for them. And interestingly, when we've gone back with the second proposal, quite often what we think might be a really attractive proposition, a lot of residents will say, oh no, I don't, you know, I think on one of them we were taking back a play space, and they weren't that keen on having the play space because it was obviously be quite close to their homes, windows, and concern about noise. So it's then where do you, as part of planning, you also have to introduce the play space. So it's like, where is it best to go? And the tricky bit also comes kind of once we get to the construction phase, and obviously we haven't got to that with Bramley at the moment, but on other schemes where we've been working, it's how do you continue that constant dialogue with the neighbours through kind of quite an intrusive process. And we're looking at ways as to how we make that kind of a more positive journey at the moment. I think offsite manufacturer, if we could get it to work, would be a really strong thing to do because it minimises the amount of intrusive noise on site. We're also looking at things whether or not we could bring forward part of the landscape on some schemes. So whether it's communal gardens or communal areas that they can use for their own planting and food growing and things like that. So there's more of a positive benefit to these places before kind of the schemes are finished and the contractors walk away.
Thank you very much, Chloe, and thank you again to all of our speakers for a really wide selection of varied and interesting projects. And I think they bear out some things that were said by each of the speakers. As Luke Tozer said, constrained sites are where design adds most value. And as Frederick then said, when you're working in a situation, or sorry, as Chloe said rather, working in a situation such as the ones we've just heard about, involves finessing a project along the knife edge of viability all the way through. But as Frederick said, that with small constrained sites, you can't be black and white about what you expect the development outcome to be based on what might apply elsewhere. And so, in fact, the apparent constraints of these sites can be opportunities. And I think all the work we've looked at today shows certainly a great deal of effort into overcoming constraints, but finding within them opportunities. So thank you again to our speakers. Thank you very much to our event partner, Schueco. And thank you as well to the audience for joining us this time. For anyone who would like to catch up with any of the presentations again or see that work again, a recording of this will be on the Architecture Today website within a couple of days. And in the meantime, goodbye and see you at the next one. Thank you.